Chapter 14, the unification of world trade. And world trade really did serve to unify the world. And we'll look at how, after 1500, ocean voyages of exploration and trade pretty much bridged Eastern and Western hemispheres. And we'll look at how trade brought unity and how it essentially would restructure much of the world, especially Europe and the Americas. One of the underlying themes of this chapter is the emergence of capitalism. And this has to do with free trade. And we talked in chapter 13 about free trade, how that meant no government restrictions. And so with no government restrictions on trade, that meant that it did away with many of the mercantilist policies that were already in place, because most major Western European governments had been following the principles of mercantilism, or the belief that the government should regulate trade, particularly by restricting the outflow of gold and silver for the greater strength of the state. And so the idea of free trade would kind of rock the world a little bit and restructure European and world life. And it led to the rise of cities and pretty much the dominance of business interests. Interestingly, the two nations that dominated the New World trade route were Spain and Portugal. And it's interesting because they really didn't have very strong business communities. Their political rulers made most economic decisions, but both countries were settled right there on the Atlantic, especially Portugal. And then Spain, of course, was just hoping that it would lead to riches, power, and more Christian converts. So we're going to start in this slide with the Spanish Empire and looking at Spain's New World conquests. So Columbus's voyages took place from 1492 to 1504, and he made 4 voyages to the New World, never realizing that he had reached the New World. But the important thing he did for Spain was that he brought it to the attention of the Spanish crown that there were opportunities for agricultural development, religious conversion, and the exploitation of gold and silver in the Americas. And so Spanish settlers began to colonize the Caribbean islands and some of the northern coast of South America. And just to throw out a vocab word at you, you've probably heard it before, but the conquistadors were the Spanish conquerors. And one of the first things that they did upon arriving in the New World was to completely overthrow the Aztec and Inca empires. So Hernando Cortez, in our book I think he's Hernan Cortez, left Spain in 1519, and he had 600 people with him, some guns, and about 16 horses. And they came into this Aztec region, who at the time was under the leadership of Montezuma. That's a T. And so Cortez initially was joined by thousands of Native Americans who wanted to overthrow the Aztec Empire. And this led to just an intense internal struggle. And they achieved a temporary peace, but it didn't last. And so the Spaniards ended up massacring several Aztec leaders during a festival. The population revolted. They killed Montezuma, believing that he was working with Cortez, and then forced the conquistadors out of the city. And Cortez himself actually suffered heavy losses, and some estimates say that he lost up to 2/3 of his men and several of his horses. But the Spanish were able to make a comeback, and they actually had some Native American allies that nursed them back to health, and they retook Tenochtitlan, which is present-day Mexico City. And so they conquered the capital city again in 1521, and it was a bitter 4-month siege of the capital. And at that point, they pretty much had the empire. And so for the next 20 years, they captured the Yucatan Peninsula and most of Central America, even though they were popular uprisings and revolts against their authority. So a similar thing happened with the Inca Empire. This time, the men were led by a guy named Francisco Pizarro. And there had been rumors of great stores of gold in the Inca Empire, which is present-day Peru. And like the Aztecs, the Inca were divided amongst themselves, fighting over who would be their ruler. And this fighting was fierce. It ended in 1532 when one of the potential rulers, Atahualpa, captured the other one and executed him. And in the same year, Pizarro came in with about 200 men, captured Atahualpa, and even though given a room full of gold as a ransom for the emperor's life, Pizarro killed him anyway because he feared a revolt. And so in 1533, he ended up capturing the Inca capital, which is Cuzco. And fighting continued there even after the Spanish conquistadors took that land. And so Spain actually had to send a government in to keep order in Peru, called a viceroyalty. So just to throw out a couple of reasons for the defeat of the Aztecs and the Inca. One of them is that when the conquistadors came in, they were already divided among themselves. Another one was that they lacked the Spaniards' technology and organization. Another one is that when their leaders were captured, they were demoralized and almost stunned to the point of not being able to fight back. And a fourth one is just that they succumbed to European diseases, which made it also difficult to fight back. So making the conquests pay. So the Spanish set up these encomiendas. Sometimes it's called the encomienda system. But these linked Indian taxes and labor to colonists in return for Christianization. And it pretty much led to high Native American death rates and was highly criticized by people even in Spain. And just to throw out a definition, the encomienda is a concession from the Spanish crown to the colonist, giving the colonist permission to take tribute or tax from a certain number of Native Americans living in a certain area. And conditions were cruel and included the conversion to Christianity. So this eventually was so criticized that it was replaced by the repartimiento system. It's a big word. And this was where the Spanish crown allowed the colonists to employ some Indians for forced labor or slavery. And this pretty much in every way looked like slavery. Even despite that, most of the wealth came from gold and silver mining. Merchant profits. Interestingly, it was not Spain itself that received the bulk of this gold and silver, especially early on, because the Spanish did not have good commercial infrastructure to take this money or take this gold and make profitable investments with it. And furthermore, they lacked the ships to carry the trade generated by this new gold and silver. And so really it was the merchants from trade cities in Europe, like Antwerp, Genoa, Amsterdam, London, and Paris, who successfully organized the necessary commercial services. So the Spanish, who had enslaved all of these Native Americans to work in the gold and silver mines, ended up not even really receiving the profits from it. So warfare and bankruptcy. This should actually be warfare, not welfare. Warfare and bankruptcy. So interestingly, many of the regions in Europe at this time were owned by certain families. And Ferdinand and Isabella's grandson, Charles V, who had become the Holy Roman Emperor, actually inherited Spain, Spanish African colonies, the parts of the Americas that the Spanish controlled, Naples, Sicily, and so he owned a large chunk of land. And Charles alienated himself from the Spanish people because, one, he didn't speak Spanish, and two, he was extremely proud and just not Spanish at all. And so Charles engaged in these wars against the Ottoman Turkish Empire in Eastern Europe and along the Mediterranean, and ended up bankrupting the treasury of Spain. And essentially he abdicated the throne in 1556 and gave it to his son, Philip II. And Philip continued these politics of war and pretty much suffered the same fate. So conditions in Spain from this point forward would pretty much go downhill for a while. So the Portuguese colonized in a similar way that the Spanish did. And in Africa, if you remember, we talked in the last chapter about Prince Henry the Navigator and how he sponsored voyages along the coast of Africa. Well, it sparked this interest in obtaining African colonies. And really the things they were looking for were Christian converts, gold, grain, fish, and slaves. And so in order to facilitate the trade of those items, they built forts along the African coast for trade. And some of them did pursue inland contacts, but it was pretty dangerous to go into inland Africa. So many times they left that to the natives. In Angola, on the west coast of Africa, the Portuguese went directly inland to bring slaves to the coast. So the Portuguese in Brazil. The Portuguese arrival in Brazil was really an accident of weather. In 1500, an expedition left Portugal going to India and was blown off course, and they landed in Brazil. And so the Portuguese claimed the land right away, but didn't really do very much to develop it until they were pressed by competition with other European nations. And so really Brazil was just a consolation prize after the rest of Europe had acquired sugar plantations in the Caribbean. And the profit in Brazil came pretty much from enslaving the people and forcing them to work in gold mines. But as far as the profits were concerned, it really didn't have a long-term benefit for the Portuguese. When the gold began to run out around 1750, Brazil and Portugal found themselves indebted to Great Britain, hooked on buying British imports, and without a means of paying for those British imports. So the gold that they had accumulated really benefited them not very much. Okay, so the Portuguese in the Indian Ocean. The main interest for Portugal was in Asia, and they pretty much fought their way into Asian ports and into the Asian economy, but the Portuguese were not able to really maintain a government domination of the area. So even though they made contact, they really didn't dominate any areas in Asia. And so merchants pursued private interest despite membership in government-controlled monopoly. And really, when it came down to it, other European nations were more powerful and more successful in Asia. And one of the reasons they weren't successful there was just because of their reputation for violence. The Portuguese tried to instill and maintain this coercive system, and Portuguese officers were corrupt and their military wasn't very good. And really, when it came down to it, they lacked the manpower to carry out the regulations and controls that they had tried to assert over Indian Ocean traders. So I just want to take a second to look back and evaluate the Spanish and Portuguese empires. The first thing is that the exploitation of the natives and their resources really was not the key to wealth for the Spanish or the Portuguese. It really, in the long run, did not help them. And so the lesson there is that you have to have good economic infrastructure to use wealth, even if you come across a lot of wealth. Another thing with Spain and Portugal is that both countries were hierarchical and they used their wealth for personal gain rather than creating like long-term investment goals, which would have continued to bring them money long down the road. The success of the Spanish and the Portuguese was obviously not in creating wealth, but was in spreading their culture to the regions they conquered. And if you look at the areas that the conquistadors conquered, there's still a lot of Spanish culture there. And even in the fact that the people speak Spanish. And in Brazil, you see lots of Portuguese culture. So really the success was in just in spreading their culture to those areas. And we will end there, and we'll pick up tomorrow with trade and religion in Western Europe.